Hey people, Siobhan here, dropping in at the start of the episode to again remind you to check out the website for the fabulous Animal Public's book series. Animal Public is part of the University of Sydney Press. I'm looking at their website right now and I'm seeing some fantastic books on offer. Authors such as John Simmons, Christine Townsend, Peter Chen, Peter Tate. Wow, Fiona Probyn-Rapsey. Jay Johnston, this is fantastic. You have got to think about getting involved with Animal Publics. If you're going to write an animal studies book, or if you want to stock up on suitable books for your institution, that's Animal Publics, part of the University of Sydney Press. This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars and animal advocates, and as we're going to see with this episode, and authors about the work they do involving animals. My name's Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by the wonderful people at ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. I've told you many times before that you should get across there and follow ASA on Facebook, and also think about coming to their conferences. They have a conference every 2 years, and I'm currently attending the 2019 Decolonising Animals Conference in Christchurch, New Zealand. Well, I'm really thrilled to be able to bring you this week's Knowing Animals guest. This is someone who I never imagined I'd have the opportunity to interview. He's one of the keynotes here at the Decolonising Animals Conference. Now, as listeners of the program know, I'm absolutely hopeless with pronunciation of names. I have been practicing, but I don't know that I've done a very good job. So please welcome to the podcast, Witi Ihimaera. No, terrible. Was that the worst you've ever heard?
Kia ora. It's Witi Ihimaera.
Ihimaera.
Yes. And, I mean, you know, this is a wonderful conference. And as you were saying earlier, everybody really does need to get involved in not only saving animals from, for instance, this afternoon, from violence, and these are domestic animals from violence, but in fact, all animals around the planet. So it's been just fantastic to be here.
Yeah. So, Witi, you are going to be well known to a lot of listeners. For me, the book, The Whale Rider, is the one that I immediately think of, and I absolutely adored the movie. But you've written numerous novels. You, of course, are a proud Maori author, but you also bring non-human animals into your writing. Can you tell listeners something about why animals feature in your work?
Well, when I first started to write, of course, I was writing about the Māori condition, the condition of being Māori in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I hadn't realised that at the same time that I was doing that I was, in fact, of course, writing about animals in New Zealand, like the whale, which we call the tohora. And then when I realised that decolonisation, the whole decolonisation process is not only just decolonising your own race, but your own gender, your own nation, your own people, and then of course animals are part of that whole world. So they are part of our world. So we are animals, and they are animals. And in Māori mythology, the god of man, or humankind, his name is Tāne Mahuta. He's also the god of trees, of forests, and of animals, including the whale, because in the early days when the world was being created and then various roles were distributed to the various gods, the whale was actually part of Tāne Mahuta's bailiwick, so that when the whales and sharks were too large to swim in lakes, he went to see his brother, Tangaroa, god of the ocean. And so it was Tangaroa who said, well, okay, they can come and live in the ocean with my own people, which were the fish. And because of that, the whale has always been known as the helper of man, because he is, and she is, our whanaunga or cousin.
Wonderful. And so you were saying last night when you gave the opening keynote address that what the whale is very important also particularly to your mother's story and her heritage. Can you say something about that story in particular?
Well, my mother is from a tribe called Ngāti Porou, and it was her ancestor, Paikea, who came from Raiatea, which is the original homeland of Māori, to New Zealand, by riding on the back of a whale. And so therefore that relationship is celebrated even today. You know, we always say that we are descended from this magnificent and momentous event in which both an animal and a human had to partner each other to save their lives, and also to be able to travel all the way from Raiatea to New Zealand. Well, what's interesting about that story, that mythological story, is that I was visiting Rarotonga around about 7 years ago, and they said to me, oh, we'd like to take you to this place where Paikea left. And until then, to me, Paikea had been this mythical person. He hadn't been a real person. But they showed me where the bay that he had left to come to New Zealand, and also where his wife had been. She waited for him to come back, and when he didn't return, then she died of a broken heart. So the incredible thing is about these myths and legends is that while we think of them as being fanciful, in fact they're not. And they hold huge messages for us, huge messages about the original communion between a man and animals, which has also been celebrated in European traditions, like the Latin word animalis is the same word that is applied to humans as well as animals, and it means having life, having souls. So I'm always aware that every animal I meet, whether it be a cat or a mouse or an insect, has a soul, and that to me is what we should be treasuring and respecting when it comes to our relationship with the entire animal world.
So as we were discussing just briefly before we started recording, you know, I'm from Australia and we have a very shameful history of colonisation and relationship with Indigenous Australians. But then I come somewhere like New Zealand and I see so much Maori language and so much greater effort to show respect and to learn and to engage. Can you say something about what you think Maori culture could teach Westerners about human, non-human animal relationships? What are some of the things that we could look to learn from?
Well, I don't think that Māori like the idea of comparing pain with pain, for one thing. And so therefore, when we think about Aboriginal people, we think of them as having had a particular experience that has been bitter, that has been traumatic. And I've actually written a book called The Trawena Sea, which was published around about 8 years ago, about the treatment of Aboriginal people in Tasmania. And it's important for me to acknowledge the fact that we both have our sovereign position, what Māori call rangatiratanga. We ourselves managed to obtain a treaty with Pākehā in 1840, a treaty that Aboriginal people did not have, and so that guaranteed us some rights. The fact that those rights were never honoured at the time created a huge pain, But the fact that there was the promise of these guarantees has meant that we've been able to negotiate into the present because we have a basis for that. New Zealand was never, for instance, regarded as terra nullius, whereas Australia was an empty country without people. In New Zealand, the acknowledgement was that there were people here. And so we have been able to negotiate on that particular platform, or from that particular platform. We, of course, had a war which occurred between 1840 and 1880. And the gains that we've been able to make today are the consequence of a lot of work, a lot of death, a lot of pain, a lot of denial in the beginning of our place in terms of equity, equality, and justice. Today is amazing. Today, because I think Māori are visible in a way that Aboriginal people are not. I mean, you see Māori all over the place. We are so visible in all walks of life. And you can therefore not deny us, because we are here, we are able to be seen. And because of that, and because New Zealand Pākehā have now understood the absolute benefits there are of having a country that thinks as one people, that is trying to create a new society, then that's why we have all of these gains, like here at the conference even, to have karakia over food, to have karakia at the beginning of a session, to have karakia at the end of it, to have the kinds of traditional ritual songs that everybody is singing. You know, it's not just Māori people, it's everybody. Means that we're fortunately in a position where our culture is being embraced. My job is always to keep the intellectual and cultural quality of that conversation at its highest level, and not allow it to be either dumbed down or sentimentalized in terms of the conduct of that relationship. And it's been a hugely proud thing for me to be here and to see this particular conference engaging so respectfully, not just with the hierarchy of human animals, but also the hierarchy of animals themselves.
And I think so much of that comes down to our wonderful conference organisers, Philip Armstrong and Annie Potts, who are very, very alive to a whole range of issues. Of course, they've called the conference Decolonising Animals. They're very interested in, queer theory and non-human animal issues, gender issues, Indigenous issues, etc., etc. And as Philip pointed out last night, you have spoken to so many really pressing and important, but also marginalised issues. What's it like being someone who academics and students all over the world are writing essays about, and whose work is being analysed for, traces of the animal and for all other kinds of important cutting-edge issues?
Well, look, I'm just doing my job, like all of us here are doing our job, and our job is to save the planet, and it is to save it from international violence. I mean, we had an event down here on the 30th of March in which 2 mosques were invaded and 200 people were involved in a massacre event. This has also happened in Australia, it's happened elsewhere in the world, but this was the first time for us. So we know that we are not alone in the world now in having to face racism. So that continues to be one of our particular fights at the moment. And so we've got a Prime Minister who is endeavouring to work with Facebook and with media and with other prime ministers and parliamentarians around the world to stop the hate messages that are proliferating over the internet. So we know that we've got, a major role in trying to stem all that and to make for a peaceful world. And the other issue, of course, is climate change. And not so much climate change, because on the same day that the mosques were attacked in Christchurch, school children in New Zealand had planned to go marching to bring attention to the issues of the climate. And they had to cancel it because of the mosque attack. But they came back and they did it later. And subsequently, school children around the world have mobilized. Now, so the issue for us is actually climate change, yes, but more important, how are we going to save the world for the children, the mokopuna or the grandchildren of the future? And we know that we have to take that on our shoulders. And if we can't, then our role will have to be to just step aside and let them do the job. Because it sounds to me and looks to me as if we have been denying the energy of this younger generation, who in many ways, because they're going to be inheriting this world, are probably the best people to do it.
Are you optimistic for the planet and for our relations with animals?
There is always hope, as Jane Goodall said, that we must always hope, because with hope, then we can continue to inspire change. If we lose hope, then we lose the will, and we may as well just lie down and die. Māori have this saying, tama tū, tama ora, tama noho, tame mate. If you stand up, you live. If you lie down, you die. And it is up to everybody in the world to stand up for non-human animals and against our extinction, and also for animals and against their extinction, because the one extinction is also the same extinction for the other.
Wonderful. Hey people, it's Siobhan here, just dropping in very quickly before we hear the 5 quick questions. Now, have you heard of the Tiny Beam Fund? If you haven't, you should have heard of them, and you're going to hear a lot more about them into the future. The Tiny Beam Fund is a US-based charity that exists for the purpose of encouraging and perhaps most importantly funding rigorous academic research looking at industrialised agriculture, specifically factory farming. And even more specifically, they're interested in critically evaluating and considering factory farming in middle and low income countries. But they've got a broad charter to cast a critical rigorously academic eye over factory farming in all its guises. Now, they currently have a grants program open. Grants are open now, and applications close on October 11th, 2019. You can apply for up to $10,000 to support your research endeavours. I have had a small grant from the wonderful people at the Tiny Beam Fund, and I really encourage you to go and check out their work and think about making a funding application. I can remember a time when it seemed almost impossible to get funds to do research into animal-related issues. And look, here we are, 2019, and we've got the Tiny Beam Fund that exists exclusively to facilitate academic research into intensive animal agriculture. So check them out. That's the Tiny Beam Fund, and their current funding grant falls under the title of the Burning Questions Initiative. Now, you can find a link to their website in the show notes, or you can put Tiny Beam Fund into Google and you'll get there. Get applying. Well, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Now, I've not had the chance to share these 5 quick questions with you because You graciously agreed to do this very much on the fly, and I've just grabbed you during the lunch hour on the first day of the conference, but hopefully you'll be able to bring to mind the responses to these questions. This is just to give us a little bit of a sense of what formed you as a writer. So I wonder, can you recall the first author who really had a big impact on you, who really swayed you as a thinker?
Well, because Māori come from an oral literature rather than from a written literature, I didn't come across written literature until quite late in my time.
Wow.
So it was mainly pop songs, and when I was a kid. So, why do fools fall in love? Why do fools No, how does it go? Why do
fools fall? Yeah. What's the next line of that? Oh goodness, I can't bring it to
I can't
mind.
remember.
Isn't that funny?
My mouth is full of food.
What about the first piece that you wrote? Can you remember your first piece of writing, substantive piece of writing?
Yes, I do. It goes, once upon a time, there was a princess locked up in a tall tower, guarded by a fierce dragon. And every day she would see a handsome prince ride by on his white horse, and she would run to the window and yell, help me, save me from this dragon. But because she was so ugly, the princes on their white horses would keep on riding further and further down the road to rescue a more beautiful princess, until one day she got so sick and tired of waiting that she went out and married the dragon.
I thought you were going to say she bust herself out.
But what's interesting about that story, that first story, which I wrote when I was about 9 or 10, and someone said it to me, he said, well, it's a very subversive story because the princes are not chivalrous. The princess is not beautiful. In the end, she has to go out and obtain her own destiny. And she does that by marrying the dragon or by embracing danger. So it's actually been one of the metaphors by which I have organised my life, to always try to be subversive, to always go into the land of danger, and from out of that land of danger, try to bring something out of it that is of some worth to people.
Wonderful. And of course, you've been hugely successful in that endeavour. Well, if you had to name one writer who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
The writer would be William Faulkner. William Faulkner wrote particularly a novel called The Sound and the Fury. And so if you read any of my work and you see all of the italics in it, that's the Faulkner effect from his book.
Wonderful. So what's the most important thing writers or novelists such as yourself can do for animals?
Remember that we are animals, and that when we write about animals, we do not do that and put them in a subordinate position, that they are our equals, that they have souls, and that their story is our story.
Wonderful. And final question, if you had the power to change one thing about the relationship between humans and animals, what would that be?
Oh, that's a good question. The one thing that I would want to change is actually to ask all of us to say, please forgive us.
Beautiful. Well, as Philip said last night, you can walk into any bookstore in all of New Zealand and your books will be proudly on display. Can you reveal here what you're working on next?
I have a book coming out in September. It's called Native Son, and it's the second volume of my memoir. And I think I've earned the right to have a bloody break.
So your next endeavour is a bit of a break. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars, animal advocates and authors about their work for animals. My name's Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.